Okay, I think we should get started. So good morning, everyone, or it might be different time zones depending where you are. I'm in London, so it's actually quite late, but great to see everyone coming in. I can see the participant number is going up quickly. So welcome. This is AIDN's first session of the Better Giving Framework webinar series. My name is Hannah McNichol, and I am AIDN's Communications and Research Lead. AIDN, or the Australian International Development Network, we were recently pleased to share draft 1 of our Better Giving Framework, which we put in the chat. And we hope everyone has read it with our network. We launched the Better Giving Framework to share what we believe and what our network has helped us to understand are the key guiding principles that underpin better giving and investing in today's international development sector. This framework was designed through leveraging all the data, insights, thought leadership pieces, philanthropod episodes, and webinars we have hosted, led, or collected since our inception in 2018. So far, we've launched the draft Better Giving Framework to our network alongside an interactive survey that will also be put in the chat, so that we can keep gathering more data from our network on what better giving to international causes looks like today. The first 2 guiding principles in the Better Giving Framework are, number 1, those closest to the problem have the best solutions, investing in local leadership, and number 2, trust-based philanthropy and unrestricted grants. These are the 2 guiding principles that we are focusing on in today's webinar. Guiding principle number 4, a focus on impact, will form the basis of our second webinar. Guiding principle number 3, partner for the long term, but also plan for sustainable graduation. And guiding principle number 5, cross-sector collaboration and partnerships. Those 2 will combine to form our third webinar, and we will give details of those at the end. In this sense, we've launched the 3-part webinar series to further foster this iterative process of learning with our network and to form a final version of our Better Giving Framework. So this means that we're taking notes of the discussion today and the questions that might roll in. And we hope that our fantastic panelists can provide some examples of these principles in practice so that our audience here can have some key practical takeaways long after the discussion has ended. And before we start, I'd also like to nod to the wider current climate in which this webinar is taking place. Since our inception in 2018, AIDN has focused on more and better giving to international causes. We've predominantly been focusing on the more giving to international causes and what that looks like. So in many ways, the Better Giving Framework is our focus on the better. That said, given recent funding cuts to aid globally, and likely that more might come, considering that the UK also slashed their budget about 2 or 3 weeks ago, more is on the radar again. Nevertheless, this focus on better is still very timely because what is better becomes all the more important when there is less being distributed. And finally, before we start, I'd also like to remind our guests that we're recording this session and to remind everyone to put questions in the chat box or the Q&A function, ready for discussion at the end. I'd now like to introduce Mark Kubert, who is the co-founder of AIDN and my co-chair of this webinar. He will be leading the discussion from now onwards. I will turn to Mark to introduce himself before we introduce the 4 panelists, Claire O'Brien, Doris King, Professor Stephen Howes, and Ivo Mahler. Mark will then lead the discussion moving forward. So Mark.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you over there in London for your evening, and good morning to everybody in our time zone. Doris is over in the States, so getting late in her day as well. Firstly, on behalf of Hannah, myself, AIDN, and everyone on the call today, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. For me, they're the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, but we've got participants right across Australia, and so we pay our respects to people in numerous lands right across this country. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My very brief introduction, leaving a world of finance in 2003 and into a world of philanthropy. I made a phone call to a local leader in 2006 who was in a schoolyard in Tanzania. We funded that entity, and that was our first grant to a local leader. By 2009, could I say we'd summoned up the courage to fund a local leader who actually was Indigenous. That was in Sri Lanka. Since then, we've funded over 200 entities through the foundations with which I've been associated with. And for at least the last 3/4 of them, that has been unrestricted grants. That's my story in brief. Clay, I'll hand over to you for your self-introduction.
Well, thanks, Mark. Yeah, actually, my career is a little similar to yours. I moved across from finance about the same time as you did, some 20 plus years ago. Since then, I've been working as an advisor in access to finance, microfinance, and international development for entities like Opportunity International, DFAT, and most recently, World Vision. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to the seminar. I've certainly seen an increase in localization in Myanmar in recent years, so I'll talk a little bit about that. And yeah, over my career, I've seen grants that are across the whole spectrum, from those that are very much trust-based to the more detailed and specific grants. So looking forward to that. Doris?
Thanks, Clay. Hi, everyone here. So glad to be part of this conversation. I'm Doris King, Program Director leading our strategic planning function at Co-Impact. Actually, I started off my professional life in the corporate sector as well. I was a corporate tax attorney in the UK before coming over to the social change side. And in terms of our link to the discussion today, Co-Impact brings together local change makers and funders from around the world to make health, education, and economic systems stronger and more inclusive, so that we can improve millions of lives. So over to you, Eve.
Yeah, so glad to be on this webinar. I'm Eve Omala. I am originally from Uganda, but I live in Brisbane at the moment. So before I moved to Australia, I actually worked as a grantee at some point in the HIV and AIDS sector, both in Uganda and the US. I also crossed over to the funding side of things, working for different foundations, such as the Sigo Family Foundation. And now I manage the local leaders portfolio at Partners for Equity. But I also founded Funding with Trust. As you hear the word, the name, it's all about funding with trust, which is really creating equitable, trust-based relationships between grantees and funders. And I'll hand over to Stephen.
All right, thank you, Eve. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephen Howes. I'm at the Australian National University in Canberra. I've been working in international development in the Asia-Pacific region for the last 30 plus years. Done various things, but I guess main stints have been with the World Bank. I was for just about 11 years with the World Bank, working on economic and infrastructure issues. Then I joined AusAid. I was chief economist there. Now I'm at ANU, where I direct the Development Policy Centre. I'm also, I chair a non-government organisation based in Papua New Guinea that works on domestic violence, family, PNG. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Well, let's dive into guiding principle number one. Those closest to the problem have the best solutions, otherwise known as investing in local leadership. What does a principle mean to me personally, firstly? Well, if you're going to elect a Brisbane City Council, you're going to elect people based in Brisbane to be on that council. If you're going to run the Brisbane Olympic Games, you're not going to set up an office in Sydney or Melbourne to run those games. So in one sense, it's obvious locals need to be closely involved in the solutions. A more nuanced answer would probably acknowledge, though, that with those Brisbane Olympic Games, they are funded by our federal government, which is based in another geography. Those games do represent all of Australia. So to some extent, other stakeholders have a say in it. Similarly, if you want to assist mothers and children in Nakuru, Kenya, you're going to base the leaders there. You might have a government relations person in Nairobi, and you may have a fundraising expert in the US. But essentially, this principle is based on the fact that you do need to have the best solutions being made by those on the ground. Doris, you referred to the fact that you co-led a refugee assistance community, and you co-founded a refugee empowerment social enterprise. Why is this first principle important to you?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mark, and actually for the reflection that it triggered. And I think maybe starting with a story, right? That's just part of my experience of co-leading the refugee assistance group. We're very much the kind of stakeholders, the amplifiers, the cheerleaders, but really the people who had the solutions were the ones that were based in the communities. We bring the support, they had the real solutions. And part of what you see is they know the problem best, I think. A story is we went to see really what did resettled refugees in the US need, given that they were, in a new country. They were trying to find their way to build their roots. What we talked to local leaders in the government was they were offering training programs for these women, but no one was turning up. Why was that the case? When you actually go and talk to the women, you find out that the training programs were offered at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the children will be coming out of school. They were nowhere near transport systems that they could get to the training programs, and they didn't have a car given they've just moved to the country and there was no license. So really it was around finding out what didn't work that we then worked with the local leaders to see what it is that would really work in terms of what it is to help people settle into their new surroundings, make sure that they are really centered in the decision making as well. So I think I will stop there and kind of can also talk about how it pivots into the work now that I do.
Yeah, on that, Doris. So you're now at Co-Impact, and where Co-Impact is giving out hundreds of millions of dollars. I think I'm right in saying. So, what does this principle look like to you at Co-Impact? Co-Impact's a very large funder. How do you translate that through to supporting local partners?
Yeah, so our fund, our grant making is to organizations that are locally rooted in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So what we look for as we build our funding partnerships with the local leaders is really is their center of gravity based in the country, in the location that they are hoping to impact and work in. And as well as that, I think it kind of balances with what will come up in principle 2 as well, is we try to do it with trust as much as we can live the trust-based principle. So it's not just moving funding in that direction, but it's also offering more flexible long-term funding. So it's not just resources, but also decision-making can be in the hands of those that are locally rooted. And we see this as being a good way to invest, not just as a matter of dignity, respect, but also those as well, right? Because rather than building something in parallel, we actually get amplified results and impacts by turbocharging the vision of these local leaders. And we do this in 3 ways. We support them in a year of strategizing. So we don't dictate their strategy. They have the strategic vision, and we give them the space and some resources to think through what would they really need to build themselves out to systemically create change that will last. Secondly is we help them reclaim learning, measurement, and evaluation, which I know is something that's very close to the hearts of many funders. But rather than do it for us, for funders as accountability, is how can they use it as a tool to really navigate through their strategy, to let them know whether they're on track or not. And the third is we really invest in their own organizational strengthening as well, so that they can be there for the long run and not just, end when a funding relationship ends, but really continue to be rooted in their communities.
Doris, have you seen cases where your methodology has not been successfully implemented? Have there been times where perhaps a bit more outside influence, a bit more outside guidance may have helped a group. You've talked of capacity building and support to build up a group to accept the funds that you give them, but have there been times where you might have thought, there should have been more of that?
That's an interesting one. I think I have cases of successful examples. I think cases where it's more guidance is needed. We do quite deep diligence at the beginning, not so much as just, is this a suitable partner to invest in, but really, is this a relationship that would work both ways, I think. And so, the partners have the track record of having been in the local context, working there for decades. We are really looking to build the trust in that. Where I can come with an example of where it's been really successful is a partner that I have supported through the journey. We're 3 years in now. At the beginning, when we entered the journey with them, they are an organization in India that works on embedding vocational education within the secondary school system. So that improves income and employment opportunities for young students, so boys and girls. It was reaching tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people within the way they were working. We got behind their vision that they thought, look, this is something that works. We now want to really work with all local governments to get this to scale up. 3 years in now, with the strategic visioning, with the support of long-term funding behind them, they are now on track to reach over 1 million. And embedding the way that they work with governments, really leveraging and knowing their way around the local system to be able to bring local resources to bear for this as well. There's been an increase in 15 times the funding that government puts into this type of programming. So just, as well as just the point of, it seems absolutely the right thing to do to center local leaders. It also makes investment sense as well for kind of the amount that we can put towards it as philanthropy.
Thank you. It's I guess what you're providing is evidence that it's not just for smaller grants to smaller local organisations. It is possible with sizable funding. Speaking of sizable funding, Stephen, you've had a background with AusAid, rest in peace AusAid, and are now in the academic world. How did this principle manifest itself at AusAid? I imagine it would have been particularly challenging for a large government organisation, but I just wonder if you could talk to those points.
Sure, Mark. Well, actually, I might start with, before I was at AusAid, I was at the World Bank. That was in the 90s and early 2000s, so quite a long time ago. But actually, this whole idea of investing in local leadership was very important to the World Bank back in those days. We used different language. We used to talk about country ownership. There was kind of recognition that unless there was country ownership, whatever project or policy you were pushing just wasn't going to work. And I think it was really a reaction to the sort of structural adjustment policy reforms of the 80s and early 90s, where governments had signed on to a lot of things but hadn't really followed through. And it was like, you could, unless you have that country ownership. We also used to talk about reform champions. You got to find a champion, right? That's your local leader, and you've got to support them. So I think those ideas are really important in the World Bank, and not just the World Bank, the sort of the broader international aid and development movement. And it culminated in 2005. I don't know if any of you remember, but there was something called the Paris Declaration. That was sort of really important at the time, where all the donors and the recipients got together and they signed on to a set of principles. And actually, the first one of those, I think there were 5 of them, the first one of those principles was country ownership. So it was really well recognized as fundamental. Then that was just not long before I went to AusAid. AusAid, I didn't find it wasn't as important. I guess one difference is that multilaterals, I think they don't get enough credit for the fact that they lend money to governments and governments implement the projects. Whereas AusAid basically implements its own projects, or DFAT now, or gives money to NGOs or contractors, but doesn't give a lot of money to actual governments to implement. But because the World Bank was lending to governments, you had to have that. You had to have the country ownership. Otherwise, the governments wouldn't borrow the money. They wouldn't implement the project. So I think the multilateral system in general should get, I know it's often seen as kind of the villain of the piece, but should get more credit for pushing this country ownership. Yeah, the bilaterals have been, I think, slower to come on board. And to some extent, the whole NGO sector, I think they were at the forefront of this, but maybe because, they set up big bureaucracies, they set up their own country offices. Also, they kind of maybe lost a bit of sight of local leadership. So, yeah, it's good to see that it's come back now, maybe with different terminology. And, we are in a crisis period, as Hannah's mentioned. I think we shouldn't forget about that context. So I'm not super confident that the framework is right, but it's a great idea. It's one we have been working on for a long time under different language, different frameworks, and definitely one we should persevere with now.
Thanks, Stephen. That's really interesting. So yeah, so whilst we might want to criticise the World Banks of this world and governments, as you point out, a lot of their money does go to local leaders. It's at the national level as to those country governments. Stephen, further on that topic, under the Biden government, USAID had an objective of 25% of their funding going to locally led organisations, and I think they worked hard at it, but only got to about 8% or so. Is that underlying that it's outside of giving to governments, that it's impossible for a foreign government with its high risk tolerances to give to locally led organisations?
Yeah, it's difficult for all governments and NGOs, yeah, unless you're required to work with governments. As long as it's optional, I think it's going to be difficult. But it's definitely, if we're looking for progress, that is the progress. I think that the multilaterals started off, maybe pushed country ownership for a long time. I think now the bilaterals have come more on board. It's good they've got targets, whether or not they're meeting them. DFAT has now adopted targets for localization. It's definitely up there in lights in a way that it wasn't earlier, 10 years ago or earlier, either with AusAid or the early days of DFAT. Yeah, the targets aren't always the right one. One target that DFAT has is the number of national staff employed by their contractors. But you've got to be very careful with that, because that could be a sort of sucking out, right? You take the best people, the best local people, you offer them they're the best because you offer them really high salaries, and they're working for an Australian contractor or Australian government. Is that localization? I don't really think so. So I think, yeah, there's more work to be done in getting the targets right, but it is a step forward that the bilaterals are sort of engaging in this in a way they weren't 10 years ago. They're sort of catching up, I'd say.
Stephen, in the academic community, is there any debate on this concept at all, on this principle?
I think it's got widespread support. I think it's just important, it shouldn't, there's obviously still, it's not that everything should be local. I think that's the important thing. At the end of otherwise, like, why do you give the money? Why are we doing this, right? So there's definitely a role for outside support. In my own experience, with Family PNG, it's a Papua New Guinean registered NGO. I'm the chair, but the majority of the board are Papua New Guinean. It's very much locally led development, but we work we help women and children get restraining orders. That's one of the things we do. That is a foreign concept, right? So, and it's a good concept. It works well. One of the things we do is we help provide a sort of a secure cloud-based client monitoring system. That's something using foreign technology. So I think it's not, we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. These foreign inputs can be useful. So aid can be useful, but yeah, without that local leadership, you're not going to, it's not going to succeed. It's not going to last. I think that's the last thing I sort of want to throw into the mix. We've got to take a long-term perspective. I think that, if we think about why there was all that emphasis in 2005 on country ownership, why it didn't last, and now we're sort of rediscovering it under a different name of local leadership. I think one reason is, we still had the short-term project cycle where whoever you are, even if you're the World Bank, you do one project for maybe 3 or 5 years, you move on, you do a different project. I think that's fine if you're building roads, but it's not going to work if you're looking at this sort of community engagement, or you're looking at governance reforms. Yeah, you need that, and generally, if you want locally led leadership, you've got to take a much longer perspective, try different things, find out what works, and stick with it. I think we need to rethink our time frames if we're going to get this locally led, make it work.
Thank you. Doris, you spent time at the World Bank, and do you want to chime in here with any thoughts as far as how you see the difference between the multilaterals policy and now what co-impact is doing these days?
Yeah, and I'm reflecting on what Stephen was just sharing, right? I think it's the alignment of the institutional incentives of within the bank sometimes as well, that if you are stuck with the long-term cycles, you move from one to the next. How do you get the embeddedness and the rootedness that you need for these long-term changes to happen? And I think, if I reflect on what we do now at Co-Impact and in philanthropy, I think it is a recognition of our positionality and our, how we fit within the long-term cycle of what actually needs to take for change to happen. We very much recognize we're only probably a very small part of the journey that these rooted social change leaders do over decades. Like, they've been there way before we are there, and they will be there way after we part our ways. So I think in some ways we've got the flexibility and nimbleness to do that a bit more in philanthropy compared to maybe my part of, where I worked in the bank, at least, the feeling that there's a lot more of a institutional structure, which makes it maybe a bit harder to do so.
Great, thank you. Look, let's turn to principle 2, which is trust-based philanthropy. In giving terms, that can well mean unrestricted grants. Principle 2 is probably a practical application of the how of principle 1. Look, for me, I started out as a naive giver. Today, I'm just a less naive giver, but I was travelling to the last mile, funding local partners, funding local leaders. But to be honest, I'm not sure I was really trusting them. We funded projects, and then there were 2 aha moments in my journey. One was a meeting with MSF, actually, a very large organisation, where we asked, well, what projects would you like funding for? And the answer that came across the table was, well, if you want to give us money, actually give, you're not buying something from us, you must be doing that because you trust us to know best how to spend that money. We don't want money for projects. We want you to give us money to trust us that we know best how to spend it. And that logic was so overwhelming. The second aha moment was actually sprung on me in a webinar with Ivo Mahler here, where I told the story of where we had lost some money through financial malfeasance, trusting a local leader. It had not worked out. And Eve threw the question back at me, well, has ever any of your funding to non-local leaders, to Westerners, has any of that ever not worked out? And the reality, or the truth to the answer to that, was yes, in many, many, many cases. So that was my second aha moment. Eve, I want to ask you, what does trust-based philanthropy mean to you? What does it look like through your career?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I remember that conversation. So thanks for being very candid about that. But yeah, so you just mentioned one of the things, unrestricted funding. If you're trusting me, trust me all the way. Don't give me money and then tell me how to use it, because already you've come to me as the person from that community with lived experience. I know exactly what to do with that money. So go full in. But also, I would like to, I think, really expand how we look at that second guiding principle on trust-based philanthropy. For a funder, for a donor to be able to give unrestricted grants, it means you're letting go of some power. We know that there is a power imbalance in this sector. We know that, of course, if you're a funder, there's just inevitably going to be that power imbalance. And what this really means is that you're recognizing that there is that imbalance. Many times, maybe it's been shaped by inherent biases. It could be the way certain races are perceived, or gender, social classes. But are you willing to, examine and let go of that and really cede power to local leaders and say, I know exactly what you're going to use this money for, and I'm trusting you to use it the way you ought to. The second thing I want to highlight is that you cannot give unrestricted funding if you're also not coming from a values-based approach. So what does trust-based philanthropy really mean to me in this instance is that, what values do you uphold as a leader? What values do you uphold as an organization? Is trust even part of it? And I'll point out 3 values really that I think ground the work that we do to really make this principle successful. One is the value of trust. If you truly trust these organizations, then give them the power to do what they ought to do with the money and what they think is right. 2 is a value of equity. Again, that still goes back to the power sharing, if I may call it that. But also, with that, I'm trusting that you, in your context, where you come from, also hold a lot of power. We forget that fact. We think that, oh, we know everything, we have all the power, but these people in the communities that we come from are also really powerful. So let's treat them that way. Let's come from that lens. Let's give them that power that they too own in their communities and let them drive what their communities ought to drive. But the third thing I want to really also focus on is relationship. That for trust-based philanthropy to work, it has to be a two-way street. You have to be ready to build a deep relationship based on transparency, based on true honesty. And that's how it's going to work. It's like a marriage. If a marriage is not transparent, if it's not honest, it's not going to work out. And in our day-to-day work with the local leaders portfolio at Partners for Equity, all the grants that we give away to our partners are actually unrestricted. They are unrestricted, and even just in the way we work with them, it's very open, it's very transparent. We tell them that we want to be the first funder that you come to when something goes wrong. And we're starting to see that many of them come to us when something goes wrong because we've really built that openness and transparency with them.
Clay, you've had a long career in this field. How have you seen trust-based philanthropy working out for you?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, well, as the principle says, it's unrestricted grants or a shift away from project-based grant making. And what's now happening in Myanmar is there is a change, and it's happening really due to the circumstances in the country. Because it's becoming increasingly difficult to reach many parts of Myanmar, due to the security situation in many parts of the country, due to the conflict that's taking place. You're seeing increasing collaboration between the larger NGOs and the smaller ones. Now, the issue is that many donors still prefer a more sophisticated formal approach and working through larger organizations. For example, one of the big donors in Myanmar is the LIFT Fund. It's a multi-donor facility funded by 12 different governments. So in a recent call for concept notes, they basically specified that 75% of the money had to go to local organizations, but they still required all of the sort of normal formal reporting and impact assessment and things. So there's definitely a conflict there. But because the larger NGOs are finding it harder to reach the field, to get to the participants that they really want to assist, therefore there are partnerships now developing between these larger NGOs. And that then becomes more based on trust. So the larger NGOs can handle a lot of the reporting that's still required, but they're now being more, as it says in the principle, creative, agile, and responsive by working with local organizations and then basing the support that they have with the local organizations on trust. So sometimes you have this sort of tripartite or even larger number of stakeholders. So the trust has to operate across this whole arrangement. So it's not just between the donor and the operator, but sometimes through other organizations that have to also in turn trust the local organizations who are in the field closer to the participants who are able to do the real work.
Clay, you've painted a picture. I think correctly, of quite a complex situations when you have all those different layers from the where the money first comes from. Sometimes one wants to shout out, just remove the risk parameters and let it go and see what comes out of it. But that's probably not feasible.
Well, I think it is. I mean, you're seeing now a move back towards that. I mean, I guess if I look at the roughly 20 years been working in development, as you would have seen too, over the first 10 years or so, in the 2000s, you had a real push for more internal processes, better reporting, moving away from those sort of rough reporting indicators to, impact based on randomized controlled trials. And that brought a greater need for overheads and related expenses. I mean, thinking about USAID, which hasn't come up yet, surprisingly, but I mean, in some ways, its demise might have been because of that move, because there was too much overhead, too much bureaucracy, if you like. So anybody who's critical of what USAID does could say, oh, all of that is a complete waste. But you certainly have a tension between, on the one hand, the need for reporting, on the other hand, all the NGOs are always subject to criticism on the basis of how much of their revenue goes on pure admin costs. So, and that's an issue, obviously, for local NGOs because they have less revenue. So that's why it comes back to that partnership arrangement. But I think we've seen a change now. I mean, the leader in this area is, of course, Mackenzie Scott, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. And actually, there's a nice quote from her that relates to the first principle. She says, teams with experience on the front lines of challenges will know best how to put the money to good use. So part of the other side of that, of course, is that she's then trusting these local organizations, and she's famous for only requiring very simple applications and light touch reporting. And the numbers I see is she's given away $14 billion to 1,600 organizations, often, small local organizations. So that's an average of about $9 million per grant. So I think you're seeing a bit of a pushback now, not just because of USAID, but I guess that was, in some ways, that was a symptom of, this over reliance on reporting and increasing in costs. And now donors are saying, oh, forget all that. I'm going to trust this organization. I'm going to help them go into the field. They do good work. They send me a 6-page report once a year. That's good enough. So I think it's interesting. We've seen a ramping up of the need for less trust, if you like, and more facts. And now I think we're seeing a decrease in that and a greater reliance on trust.
Interesting. Yeah, you have painted the picture of a couple of the changes in the sector, some of them just in the last few months, and perhaps the reasons behind that. Eve, just a question for you. Could you give an example of where you've seen trust-based philanthropy working effectively, or perhaps it might even be a case where there was not trust-based philanthropy, that situation might have changed, or even where not having that trust has caused issues?
Yeah, I think I'll start with the last bit of your question. And again, I'm going to share from experiences that I've seen with our partners. But we had an experience, one of our partners reached out to us where they were getting funding from, again, a well-meaning funder who only focuses on sexual reproductive health. And they were giving them a sizable grant, which was almost about, 40% of their budget, I think I may say at the time. And, the funder was really set on them only doing sexual reproductive health, that, COVID happens, they're having hungry people, they're having all these things happen at their doorstep, and the funder is clear, you cannot use my funding for anything else but sexual reproductive health. And they pose a question to a funder. So do you really think women are going to accept to get contraceptives when they have no food? Can we even go out there and start to tell them about, reproductive health without meeting their most immediate needs? And that was very painful to that partner, of course. And eventually, when we had that conversation, they asked for a very honest opinion. And we told them, you know what? Stay away from that funding. I don't think this is a trust-based relationship. And you don't want to be having a relationship with such a funder. And, good enough, another funder from Australia actually came on board and said, we shall help you close that gap that this funder has left, but we are going to give you that money in unrestricted funds. And, they were able to, of course, come in and meet the most immediate needs of their community. But, when we talk about how, unrestricted grants have helped the groups that we work with, and again, COVID is a very good example. When COVID happened, when these crises happen, right now we're having another crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And because we do give our partners, money that's untied, they can go and use it where it's most needed. Right now, one of our partners in Congo that's really struggling because many of their beneficiaries have been affected by the conflict that's happening with the M23 rebels. They know that when our money comes for Partners for Equity, we can allocate it to where it's most needed. So they've actually been making those decisions without even having to tell us, and we don't care if you tell us or not. They've been able to, make those decisions very quickly, move very quickly, be relevant to the community, because also as a local organization that is being trusted by your community, you need to remain relevant. And there's a question that people ask sometimes. When you look at many of the locally led organizations, you'll find that they do a bit of everything. They do a bit of healthcare, they do a bit of education, they do a bit of this. And sometimes people brush that off as they're too scattered. They do not know what they're doing. But I think it speaks most obviously to the problems that they're facing in the community. You have to be relevant everywhere. If someone comes to you and they're being treated for malaria, but they are hungry, their kids are not going to school, you very quickly realize that you've got to address all of that. So if you give them restricted funding, and in that season, it is a famine. We had that as an issue. During COVID, one of our other grantee partners was having an issue of locusts and famine, that they could no longer focus so much of their funding on healthcare, but to meet those needs. So it's those kinds of things that I've seen practically working, and that's where the value of unrestricted funding has come in.
Gotcha. Thanks, Eve. Thank you for that insight. I'll remind everyone who's listening, if you wish to ask questions of the panel, please put them in the chat, and we will get to them before we close out the hour. In putting together these better giving principles, we've really set out to start a debate in the sector, and we have had feedback from a number of you, and we look forward to more feedback. I just want to touch on some of that feedback and a question for Clay and Eve on this. A few points of paraphrasing some of the feedback. A terrible local leader is just the same as a terrible foreign leader. The issue is how the whole organisation works. Another point. Agree totally with this principle. However, locals in developing nations have limited access to knowledge of technological gains or new innovative solutions that have been tried and tested elsewhere. Sharing of knowledge across countries is important. Another point, to implement this principle, it's not about whether the leaders are foreign or local. I see it as about how decisions are made and by whom. And then one last point, it's helpful to have fundraising where the funders are. So, Eve, firstly to you, does this mean the ideal combination might be a local leader making the decisions on the ground, but to the extent they can get assistance from outside their community, outside their country, it can only be a good thing?
Yes, there is definitely benefits to that who is driving the agenda, first of all. I like the point that they said, local leaders sometimes don't have access to the technology or whatever the knowledge that's out there. And that's important, for that to come to them. But I think the most important part is how that knowledge comes to them. If that knowledge is coming in a top-down, and I've seen this, it's coming in a very top-down kind of way, it's not going to work. We've seen people that have gone and designed very good solutions out of California. Some of these have been flow solutions, like, dirt flows and converting those into something else. Come to Africa. Yes, it's good. It's a novel idea. Implement that. And these flows won't work because of the humidity and everything. But they didn't consult with the locals. It is good. It is welcomed. But even the way in which that new knowledge is implemented needs to be very collaborative. Both sides have to come in and really work what's context specific, contextualize it to the community in which you're working, I think will be the one thing. But I think it is a partnership, and we can't say local, it's just local organizations and foreign organizations can't achieve much. No, I could point to many foreign-led organizations in Africa that are doing great things. But when I look at the very successful ones and how they're working, many of those have still gone and actually sought local opinions, local knowledge. And if you now look at the compositions of their teams, a lot of the programs are actually being designed in collaboration with the local communities and the people that they work with.
And Clay, your thoughts?
Yeah. Yes, no, I agree with Eve. I think partnerships are part of the answer. So if you have these larger international organizations with global experience, they can work well with the smaller ones in the field, but subject to a number of preconditions. And real collaboration is, I think, what Eve was talking about is really important. Respect between the organizations and actually trust. I mean, we talk about trust between donors and NGOs, but I mean, you need trust within that whole relationship between all of the partners within that. So whilst the larger NGO can bring the experience, the expertise, and the systems, some of the reporting mechanisms that the donor may require, it's really the local NGOs doing the work. They're closer to the project participants, working hands-on. So you can support them with whatever is needed. But I think trust is crucial. And it's also crucial for the participants. I mean, the participants, they will be happier possibly working with a local NGO. But also you can build trust by saying, okay, behind these local NGOs is a larger international organization. And I've seen that in Myanmar. I mean, World Vision was running a number of projects in areas that were very difficult to reach, areas like Kachin and Shan State. But increasingly, even in the dry zone now, it's difficult to work. So increasingly, the international organization has to rely on the local partner. Obviously, you don't want to put the local partner in harm's way. So security and safety is still absolutely crucial. You don't want to just throw the local NGO into a difficult situation. But if you've got trust and collaboration across all of the people involved in a partnership, which I think can help localization work more effectively, then I think that is a good part of the solution.
Great, thanks, Clay. Hannah, I might hand back to you if we've got any questions in the chat. Or certainly, we still welcome more questions along the way. We've still got a few minutes.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yes, we had one really great question come in from Yen Lee. Thank you, Yen. And this was a question that actually I had similar thoughts. I recently had the privilege of going to a Co-Impact event in Melbourne and had similar thoughts about Co-Impact puts so much effort and resources into creating programs that are appropriate for local conditions, and they also take an intersectional feminist approach, considering that women in different women experience forms of oppression in very unique ways, depending on a whole intersection of things: class, race, gender, it goes on. And then if you do all that effort at the local level, but then you want to scale up, then do you lose some of that effort from the bottom, or how do you take it forward? And so Yen's question was similar to that. You have emphasized scalability. Oh, sorry, for Doris. You have emphasized scalability of a program as part of the success selection criteria for funding. I wonder if Co-Impact could consider a locally led program that has been proved helpful to the local community, but replication could be a challenge given that the model was developed to respond to local characteristics. Would you be able to speak a bit to that tension and how you do scalability in that context, Doris?
Yes, well, thanks for the question, Yen, and thanks for the framing as well, Hannah. Look, I think we're just going to be quite honest and naming that as Co-Impact, we are a certain type of funder, and we come in to support those few, I would say, unicorns. Is that the right term in this context? Of those local leaders who have found solutions that really work for the context that they're in, and have the relationship with the system actors. So quite often it's the government, other external stakeholders as well, and then are able to scale. So that's not for everything. So like we don't believe that we are providing, all our partners that we are able to find will find the panacea for every single opportunity. But what we do also do is work in collaboration with others. So even though those that fund really grassroots organizations, really well-rooted, have very localized leaders and solutions are not our mainstay of what we fund. We also build alliances with others. So we also provide funding as a funding partner to others like women's movements and feminist funds who are able to fund in that more locally rooted way, just by example, to some of those. Because, you know, recognizing we do have certain requirements. Not everyone's going to be a fit. We have reporting requirements, which in some ways it wouldn't fit a grassroots organization, right? We tried to lighten it, but it's still a lift. So it's just trying to find out how we all best play to our strengths within the ecosystem and support each other as well.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Doris. I have a question for Eve. This is from Michaela. I think it's very relevant, and I think that it also leads to some questions potentially for Stephen after. So the question for Eve is, thank you for your comments. How do you see donors contributing to building trust and value sharing without swinging too far the other way and risk providing unsupported or non-co-designed investments?
I think if I get that question correctly, shifting more to the other side is really not holding your grantees accountable in the name of trust. I think that's what you mean.
Yep.
First and foremost, I would say any relationship without any kind of accountability is not a solid relationship. In any relationship that we are in, we need to be able to hold each other accountable. And this is really what some of the foundations of trust-based philanthropy are. You know, that we as funders are being held accountable by our grantee partners. And some, you know, the way some funders do it is by doing a grantee perception survey, where your grantees really tell you what they think about you. You ask very candid questions about whether you're transparent in your processes, whether you apply a trust-based lens, but also, you know, with funders, they too need to hold grantees accountable. And one thing I've seen is that grantee partners need that outside eye. Yes, they might know everything, they might have lived experience, but sometimes when we visit, you'll see something that they haven't seen or come up with an idea that they haven't thought about. We ask a few questions here and there, and they're like, oh, I never thought about that. And also, the one thing with funders is that depending on how big your portfolios are, you have access to so many projects, you speak to so many people, you're hearing ideas here and there and there and there, and all those things just keep, you know, they keep your brain running with ideas. And when we have these conversations with our partners, sometimes we ask them, have you heard of what so-and-so is doing in this area? And they will go and learn from those kinds of models. So I believe we all need each other. And it is a miss for a funder to take the, you know, this idea that, no, I'll fully trust them. I won't check in on them. It's really a miss for them to really be able to help this organization grow and really achieve the most with their programmatic impact. I think funders too have something valuable to contribute. They are not just, you know, someone to just, you know, write the check and leave it to the organization, but they too are uniquely placed to contribute in shaping the running and I guess the programming of this organization.
Thanks, Eve. I think that was a really good response, and it touched on some discussion we had earlier with Stephen, where Stephen, you mentioned how sometimes people might think that trust-based philanthropy or complete localization means that we are not importing any types of foreign concepts or values at all. But in actual fact, that relationship between a grantor and a grantee would never have really occurred if the grantor hadn't had an idea that they want to, and we don't want to use necessarily the word impose, but a value or a concept that we think would benefit people in another country. As you mentioned, domestic violence. We have some concepts which were built up well in Australia, and we think that they would be beneficial to bring to PNG, I believe was the context. Would you better speak a little bit more to that inherent tension and how we can work it out kind of practically?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's not really a tension. I think it's a partnership, and if it works well, you know, definitely they're useful ideas, right? So if they work, then that'll become obvious, it'll become evident, and they'll be embraced. If they don't work, you know, we can move on, try different things. I think it's, you know, one thing I've been reflecting on, and, you know, when I go back to the original point I made about like the Paris Declaration, country ownership, was the top issue. Why didn't it take off? And I think one reason is, it does depend on the country context. And, country ownership is much easier idea in, say, a country like Vietnam or Indonesia than it's going to be in a country like Myanmar or Papua New Guinea. What we call fragile states. Countries where, the government's not actually well-intentioned, right? Well, big parts of the government are not well-intentioned. They're actually ripping off the country, right? Country's not working well. And it's not like in those countries, I mean, some of them then have great NGOs, like Bangladesh, but like in a place like PNG, it's not like there are fantastic NGOs sort of all waiting for money, all set up, with good anti-fraud procedures and so on. It's a struggle. So it's very important, I think, to be realistic about the recipient side and not just sort of castigate donors. I think that's an important part of the balance. But I think the way to get around that and Michaela's problem, risk that she points that you'll end up funding projects that don't work, is that whole thing, like you try different things. And yeah, if it doesn't work, you accept that and you move on, right? But if it does work, you don't, I think too often then don't. If it does work, they're going to move on anyway, right? Like, oh, that worked, we'll do something else. If it works, you stick with it, right? Especially in these difficult environments, these fragile states. If something's working well, you stick with it for the long term. Maybe you scale up, provide more funding, and you build on success. Yeah, I think that's a really important principle if any of these ideas around local ownership and around trust are going to work.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephen. And that just leads, I think we have 2 minutes left. So we might squeeze in one tiny little final question that's come from Rosie. And you mentioned scale there. So I might direct this to Clay. And Rosie says, how do you define scale? Does it have to be replication, or can it be considered knowledge sharing or establishing models? Or Ree says it can be adapted. And you have 1 minute. Thanks, Clay.
Thanks. Yeah, I think all of that is scale. I mean, it's not pure replication. In fact, I think localization really is a way to avoid replication, because if you just took a model and applied it all around the world, it wouldn't work. So working through local NGOs is the way to tailor whatever project you have to the local environment. So, and that's part of growing scale. I mean, I guess there's a temptation to look at scale based on the number of beneficiaries or participants, but I think it's much broader than that. And I think working through local partners also means that there's a sustainability as well with the project. Sometimes the international NGOs move on to other areas. I mean, World Vision spends 17 years in their areas, so it's quite long term, but others perhaps not so long term. So I think all of that's part of scale. Sharing knowledge, bringing ideas in, but making sure they're not imposed, and also establishing models and resources that can be adapted and are adapted to the local context. So I think that all the points Rosie makes are very valid.
Okay, great. Thank you, Clay. And on that note, I think we will wrap up, seeing it is 1 minute to go. So I'd like to thank my co-chair, Mark, who's done a fantastic job of leading the discussion. Obviously, our 4 panelists, Clay, Doris, Stephen, and Eve, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your wisdom with us and your practical examples. And of course, thank you to all our participants for the fantastic questions and for listening along. As I mentioned at the start, the Better Giving Framework is made up of 5 principles. Today, we covered number 1 and 2. We will have 2 more webinars coming up over the next 6 weeks. The next webinar will be in mid-April and will be focusing on impact. And the 3rd webinar will be about cross-sector partnerships and what we do at the end of partnerships, sustainable graduation, and how we actually move off a partnership. And that will be in early May. So thank you, everyone. And I look forward to the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Have a good day.